for my philosophy of art course, a lecture on Immanuel Kant, or introducing from a certain angle Kant's aesthetics. Okay, I'm sorry to be back on distance, maybe just for a week, but we're in an outbreak at Dickinson, evidently. All right, we're coming off Hume, going to Kant. Immanuel Kant is an overwhelmingly significant figure in the history of philosophy, for better and worse. His only rivals really are Plato, Aristotle, Hume in the Western tradition. Yeah, Descartes. I should really think that through before I start yapping. But a lot of people will make him number one and a pivotal turning point, no matter how you cut it, in the history of philosophy, with his doctrine of transcendental idealism, among others. So he makes absolutely fundamental contributions in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, that we've been discussing ever since, and in aesthetics. I think that at least, say when I was coming up in the 1980s and stuff like this, and still probably today, if you ask aesthetics specialists, what is the central text of their discipline, they might first go like, well, there should be no central text of this discipline, or any discipline necessarily, of course. But if you force me to answer, it's Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment, also known as the third critique. The first being the critique of pure reason, metaphysics and epistemology, the critique of practical reason, which is his work on ethics, and then the critique of judgment. In some ways, the classic work in the history of aesthetics, and in many ways, the foundational work in properly philosophical aesthetics, for some of the reasons we're going to see. Kant didn't coin the term aesthetics. That was coined by his older contemporary. I think they overlapped a little bit. Alexander Baumgarten. The term refers to the conditions of perception, and maybe the conditions under which perceptions take on significance or meaning. Maybe that's awfully general. But the term aesthetic and the idea of aesthetic properties, beginning with beauty and sublimity, which we'll discuss in relation to Kant, really takes form at this moment in this text. Now, he goes directly at the antinomy of taste, what I call the antinomy of taste, directly out of Hume. In fact, a lot of Kant's philosophy is a response to Hume, which is rather interesting. Hume's challenge was fundamental. If nothing else, Hume's challenge to ideas about human knowledge and so on, as well as maybe on matters of taste, was so fundamental to Kant and thus to the history of philosophy, and not only thus with Hume's contribution. But, so it would be natural to go, since we were just talking about the antinomy of taste, and we'll do Kant on that on Zoom on Friday, live. I want to actually segue from Plato instead and talk about in very rough terms, the development of the modern concept of fine art. All right, so I think that, it's an interesting question whether the ancient Greeks have a concept that corresponds to our, or say the 1950 concept of fine art. We've worked on this. I think that, the reason people read Book 10 of the Republic as the original classic in aesthetics is because it organizes these things that we call arts, poetry, painting, sculpture. Does he say puppetry? Or is that Aristotle, I think? Um, some forms of dance and others as mimetic techne. Techne, again, has the sense of skill. Okay, or technique, right? I mean, it is, again, the origin of our word technology, for instance. Making stuff, but totally in general, okay? Making stuff skillfully. So, any craft counts, any skill. Farming is a techne in this sense, let's say. And medicine is a techne in this sense. All this is repeat. The advance in the Republic is to say, well, there's a certain range of these that are mimetic, representational in content, all right? Or we might say semantic. If you're a leather worker, your belts don't necessarily refer to or mean something, okay? But if you're a poet, you're telling a story about somebody, or if you're Homer, for example, or making a beautiful lyric about somebody, or trying to capture the essence of love, like if you're Sappho in a poem, okay, like imitating is what they call it. Mimesis. Imitation is in English, as I've said, as we've seen, I think, is probably impoverished, especially when you get to Aristotle and you're imitating general concepts and truths and stuff like that. All right. Well, that still is not the modern conception. Modern. So let's try. 1760 to 1960? At longest. The concept of fine art. The high arts, the important arts, the significant arts. I mean, for one thing, art kind of needs some kind of defense. Plato says it's just imitation. And so it's not important. In fact, it's deceptive. Okay, all this stuff. But by the late 18th century, there's connoisseurs that spend their lives trying to understand, the paintings of Michelangelo or the Greeks, like they're real connoisseurs of the ancient Greeks, like Winkelmann. And they're exalting art. It's much more significant. I mean, even in the basic Neoplatonic response that we've discussed to Plato's critique, the idea that art can take you to a higher realm or something like that. The arts, I would say, starting in the Renaissance, become more and more exalted, and the artist becomes more and more exalted, but it's a process. In the medieval period and through the Renaissance, depending on where exactly you are, painters and sculptors are in craft guilds, okay? And it's basically considered a form of manual labor. That starts to change as time goes on. You can see this, for example, in the first great art historian, Giorgio Vasari, who starts to really exalt these figures, man. When he starts talking about Michelangelo, he portrays him as a god, basically, the concept of genius is arising, and the idea is that someone like Leonardo, or, for Vasari, really Michelangelo, is just a transcendent and extremely historically significant human, okay? Like, this is one of the great achievements by one of the great geniuses, the Sistine ceiling, let's say, by one of the great geniuses in human history. Well, that's not really the way. Like, people would admire the sculptures of Praxiteles, or, the people who decorated medieval cathedrals, with paintings and sculptures and stained glass and so on. They'd admire the work and think of it basically as a kind of manual labor. You know, it's pretty continuous with the work of building the cathedral itself, the armature of the cathedral itself, requiring a lot of the same skills and so on. Okay? But then, so in the Renaissance, and you get these figures like Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, Dürer, let's say. It's like, okay, these are geniuses on the level of Plato or Galileo or something like this, do you see? But doing something else. So what are they doing, and why is it important? Is it important? Can we explain that? Why is it different than other things? Why is Michelangelo different than, someone who's painting a mural in the hall of a school or something like that? Well, someone like that might be really, really good. But, or painting calendars, pinups or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, what makes this transcendent? What makes it important? And, starting, I think, around when Kant writes, we really do start greeting people as these transcendent geniuses in virtue of their amazing work. So, Beethoven is an early example of this, contemporary of Kant. Just this idea that kind of this whole world is emerging from the struggles of his gigantic mind, and it's all embodied in this incredibly significant, although completely abstract, formal music, or pretty abstract, usually abstract. We have to think about that and think about the philosophy of music. What does music mean? How does music mean? Or the way we came to think about figures like Picasso or Pollock or literary figures, James Joyce, Baudelaire, or something like this. Like these kind of almost God-touched or inspired geniuses. And in their work as some of the greatest things that humans have ever produced. Like, that's not an inevitable concept. And a lot of people think, and the very eminent philosopher of art, art critic Arthur Danto, argued that concept, that kind of exalted concept of art as the best of human beings, and maybe like a crystallization of history, is over. It ended in 1963, according to him, more or less when he walked into a gallery and saw Warhol's Brillo boxes, which de-exalted art from this idea. But also, like, right around when Kant writes, I think we're seeing modern conceptions of performance and display of art emerge. The modern art museum, or something like what we think of as the art museum, only really emerges in the 18th century. Where you might go to see a comprehensive collection of paintings or something like that. I think even the Louvre begins to take on that flavor. As opposed to like maybe a cabinet of curiosities where you see all kinds of works of human handicraft and, unusual natural things as well. Or the way like we might behave in a concert hall, seeing a symphony, like try not to cough, okay, as opposed to like, going to bear baiting or something like that. I bet the audiences at the Globe Theater for Shakespeare's plays were pretty raucous, okay? But maybe 100 years later, like you're looking at maybe some French classical drama, you're probably pretty concentrated on the work itself. And you're absorbing it, as Kant would say, I guess, with a certain sort of distance or disinterestedness. We'll have to say what that means. You're absorbed in it, but you're also experiencing it not in a way that would start making you scream or something like that, one way or the other, but in a way where you're going like, wow, this is really beautifully constructed. Like, look at how this plot unfolds. What an amazing performance by that actress, etc. All right, where you're really absorbed in the thing itself and not maybe, the way it plays out, thinking about your life or something like that. All right. Or the book of poems, like the serious poetry book, as opposed to like a doggerel or some limericks or something like this, like things to which a kind of awe is appropriate, or at least as a first move, like, or at least a kind of seriousness of regard that you wouldn't have for popular entertainments or something like that. All right, so let's look at Kant setting out this concept, which he does so clearly, actually. These are sections, this is 43 and 44 of the Critique of Judgment. In this edition, is that the first edition? It's on pages 148 and 149. So what's it, a 16 higher in the second edition, if you're using that? This is an annoying feature of our class. We've got two editions of the same book going simultaneously. I left my other edition at the office, so. Okay, so, and we can think about this in relation to the concept of mimetic technique, let's say. First of all, works of art are distinguished from works of nature. Okay, and that's basically the techne idea. Anything artificial is art in that widest sense, something that human beings make. Something made by artifice, something made intentionally, okay? So, yeah, the works of nature, as he says, I guess here, art is distinguished from nature, as making is from acting or operating in general, and the product or the result of the former is distinguished from that of the latter as a work from operation. I'd say, so for one thing, one difference between art in the super general sense, whatever human beings do, is that it's basically intentional. It's end goal directed in a different way. Right? And like I say, this is just technique, techne, the same notion again. And the word art, I should look at the German or whatever, but the word art in English is still used this way. The art of the cupcake, you might say your car mechanic is a real artist or something like that. People would understand what you meant. Very skilled, right? Okay. And it's different because it's human action. And so it's different because it's free. That is, making art is different than, the way a flower blooms or something, because it's the result of human decisions. And so, for one thing, it takes on an ethical content that it wouldn't otherwise have. All right. Okay, now art is also distinguished from science. This is an interesting distinction, because we should probably think about whether art is a source of knowledge, and if so, how, and what kind of knowledge. And is it a source of totally different kinds of knowledge than science, for instance? I guess you could ask, for example, whether Einstein's theory of relativity, let's say, is a work of art. Maybe not exactly. All right. So one thing is about gathering knowledge through observation, and the other is about reconstructing, remaking reality. All right. One is about observation. One is about manipulation. Let's say one is active and one is passive. Well, I don't know how passive science is. Maybe the picture is that science is passive, like receiving information rather than making something. he says art as human skill. This is on 149 in section 43 of the Critique of Judgment. Art as human skill is distinguished also from science as ability from knowledge, as a practical form, as a practical from a theoretical faculty, as technique from theory. So art is practical. It involves changing things, okay, in a way that science does not necessarily. Actually, this is kind of a false picture of science, but it involves observing the world accurately, reflecting it accurately. That's mimesis, actually. But it's not fine art. Art, and this is really key, and this is key to the emergence of the fine art concept, which I'm not saying is invented by Kant. He's kind of hooking on to something that's emerging, I think, in European culture, maybe for a century or even more before this. But this is the key thing. Art is further distinguished from handicraft. And this will help you exalt the arts insofar as handicraft is regarded as somewhat low because of manual activity. The first is called free. The other may be called industrial art. Freedom is involved in fine art in a way that it is not in handicraft. In a way, in craft, you're enslaved by the purpose of the crafted object. You're constrained by, formally, in what sort of thing you make. You're constrained by the purpose of the practical item that you're producing. Right? But art is free of those practical purposes in a way that opens it to expressive capacities that handicraft does not possess. It opens up all kinds of possibilities as soon as you abandon a particular, end or configuration that you have to realize in order to realize a practical goal. Right? In a way, it frees you from practical goals. That's what he has argued up until now. We're in the middle of it, and we're going to go back to the beginning of it to get the idea of disinterested pleasure and his take on the antinomy of taste. All right. So if you're kind of worried that art can't be a very, very high kind of thing because, after all, it's just making things with your hands, this is, again, a way of exalting it. It's beyond practical purposes. It's an expression of human freedom, like maybe the highest expression of human freedom for Kant. Art frees us from labor, which is, in some sense, degrading, I think, for Kant, but not only for Kant. It has a spiritual content in that sense. It has a content in human freedom, whereas craft objects have a content, of human need. They serve human need. But art serves only itself, or expresses human freedom, or something like that. Okay. And like I said, I think that is the central conceptual advance here. To say that art is more than craft, it's an expression of the highest human freedom, or something like that. Right? So this is what he says. Finally, like I say, bringing the concept of fine art together and making it fully explicit in a way that it was incredibly influential within the arts, and I want to discuss that as well. I think this is one way you get to abstract painting, for example, in the West. He says, this is on 149, section 44, where art, merely seeking to actualize a possible object to the cognition of which it is adequate, does whatever acts are required for that purpose, then it is mechanical, if you're just trying to get the best cup or something. But should the feeling of pleasure be what it has immediately in view, then it is termed aesthetic art. Okay, so aesthetic art doesn't have a practical purpose except amusement, pleasure, giving pleasure. Okay, and then there's two kinds of aesthetic art in that sense: agreeable art and fine art. Agreeable art is whatever gives you pleasure, like just a fun like disco song that makes you twitch and boogie or something like that. So popular art, I think what we're doing here is one thing we're eliminating is sheer popular art, or distinguishing popular art from fine art. So that's how I would really narrow down this conception of fine art. It's distinguished from craft, and it's distinguished from merely popular art. And that's why, as Prabuddha and others might suspect, there might be a class problem here, or interesting class issue. Like your mere entertainments, your bastardized country music or something, as opposed to our refined appreciation of Brahms, something like that. All right. Okay. But should the feeling of pleasure be what it has immediately in view, then it is termed aesthetic art. As such, it may be either agreeable or fine art. The description agreeable art applies where the end of the art is that the pleasure should accompany the representations considered as mere sensations. The description fine art, where it is to accompany them considered as modes of cognition. So one thing he's arguing here, and it's a complex thought, I guess, is that there is the pleasure in fine art comes from a complex act of cognition, intellection, rather than just like, oh man, that's sweet, just like feeling the boogie or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like, it makes you think, okay, in a complex ways, maybe different arts in different ways, but it's cognitively significant, okay, not just fun. And that's what makes it different than popular art. And finally, fine art is the art of genius, he says. Okay, true fine art can only be produced by people who have a kind of transcendent faculty, marked by originality above all, formal originality. And that's just the way we started thinking about the artistic geniuses around this time. Again, Beethoven, or Picasso, or Van Gogh, or, so people who can change the world through their originality, change the way we see the world through this amazing faculty of originality. So he says, for example, this is in section 66 on page 150 of the yellow one. Is that yellow? We're arguing about this, yellow or orange. From this it may be seen that genius, one, is a talent for producing that for which no definite rule can be given. You can't teach genius. I can teach you how to paint, but I can't teach you to be a Picasso, right? And not an aptitude in the way of cleverness for what can be learned according to some rule. You can be a really good, slick art student and not be an original genius. It's the way we've been thinking about artists ever since, but it's also kind of the way Vasari was thinking about Michelangelo a couple hundred years before this. And consequently, originality must be its primary property. I mean, originality was valued in the arts to some extent before this. Certainly, again, say Vasari on Michelangelo, that's part of what he appreciated so deeply. But on the other hand, being able to do the codified thing extremely well, to paint the Madonna and Child, in a traditional fashion and just beautifully, that was also considered a worthy goal of an artist, I think. But here we focus on the genius or the original figure. Um, since there may also be original nonsense, sheer originality is not enough. Its products must at the same time be models, be exemplary, and consequently, though not themselves derived from imitation, they must serve that purpose for others, i.e., be a standard in the rule of estimating. So, these are the works of a genius and of fine art, hence, are exemplary works in this way, and beyond rules. It cannot indicate scientifically how it brings about its product, but rather gives the rule as nature. Hence, where an author owes the product to his genius, he does not himself know how the ideas for it have entered into his head. That's interesting. And often, I guess, excellent artists will tell you that, will report being inspired and they're not sure where this shit came from, really. I've heard that, or even thought it a time or two. Nor has he it in his power to invent the like at pleasure. It happens to a genius in a way, like it emerges from what he is spontaneously in a way, or almost involuntarily, right? Like as though it was nature, as though it came from him as as nature, as though it were natural to him. Okay. So, like I say, I mean, it's interesting to think about whether concepts have histories. It's easy maybe to think about art as something that has, people do think about it like this, as art as something that's always existed as long as human beings have existed and always meant the same kind of. Well, I don't think so, really. Like, techne, ars in Latin, the way they were talking about art in 1450 is really, really different than the way they're talking about it in 1780, okay? And it may be that this concept of art, which Kant purports to be defining an antecedent concept that, of fine art, and we're going to see a whole bunch of attempts to define this concept. What is fine art? Kant's is really the first clear one. Okay, I mean, but again, the claim is maybe this concept disintegrates at a certain point historically too, because of its internal tensions, or because history stops throwing up examples of it and starts throwing up examples of something else, and we start calling that art. All right, so, but next time, live on Zoom Friday, we're going to talk about Kant on the antinomy of taste. See you at a distance.